Hi, I'm Chris Green, the History Chap, telling the forgotten stories from British history. Now, most people have never even heard of Tristan da Cunha, a remote volcanic island in the South Atlantic. Nor do they realise that it's a British territory. Nor that it was the location of the last naval engagement between Britain and the USA during the War of 1812. But how on earth is this island a British territory at all? Well, it all has to do with both the Napoleonic Wars and that War of 1812 too. In 1816, Britain dispatched a garrison to the remote island. The reason? To thwart French attempts to rescue Napoleon from his exile on St. Helena. And the War of 1812 angle? Well, I'll tell you all about that in a little while. When the British garrison left, 3 men stayed behind and became the founding fathers of a community that still lives there today. This is the remarkable tale of how those conflicts from long ago gave birth to Britain's most remote colony, Tristan da Cunha. Tristan da Cunha, still a British overseas territory, is often described as the most remote inhabited island on Earth. With a population of just over 200, it lies in the vast South Atlantic Ocean, roughly halfway between South America and South Africa. Its closest inhabited neighbour is St. Helena, some 1,510 miles to the north, which is a greater distance than between London and Moscow. Meanwhile, Cape Town is 1,700 miles to the east. The island is part of a small archipelago of 6 islands, but only Tristan, the largest at 38 square miles, is permanently inhabited. Yet, this is no tropical paradise. There's no airstrip, no natural harbour, and even today, the island can go for months without a ship making landfall. The approach to Tristan is fraught with danger, unpredictable currents, sudden storms, and sheer cliffs that guard the coastline. The central volcanic core, Queen Mary's Peak, rises to over 8,000 feet above the surrounding sea and dominates the island. A narrow strip of green land near the coast is all that can be cultivated, and even that is often battered by ocean winds and sudden storms. In the early 1960s, the entire population was evacuated to England after the volcano erupted. And amazingly, having sampled the delights of so-called civilization, most of them chose to return home. This close-knit, hard-working community almost reflects the island itself. Tristan was first sighted in 1506 by a Portuguese admiral, Tristan da Cunha, after whom it's named. Despite its remote location, the island was actually on the route that many ships took from Europe to the Cape. In the age of sail, ships would effectively zigzag down the Atlantic to avoid the equatorial doldrums. Picking up the northeast trade winds from Europe to the Caribbean, they would then hug the coast of modern-day Brazil before picking up the westerly winds towards the Cape of Good Hope. And slap bang in that last leg was Tristan da Cunha. However, it was over a century after the Portuguese admiral had discovered the island before a crew actually landed there. They were from a Dutch ship in 1643 who replenished their supplies with fresh meat from the seals and penguins, as well as water. In the 1650s and 60s, the Dutch considered making it a supply base, but the plan was ultimately abandoned due to the island's fierce seas and lack of a secure anchorage. In the 18th century, it became the stop for whalers and sealers. In 1790, Captain John Patton of Philadelphia wintered on the island, harvesting, that's the right word, an astonishing 5,600 sealskins. But no one actually bothered to stay on this isolated and desolate island. There was a fleeting suggestion by the British Navy that it might serve as a penal colony after the loss of the American colonies. The Admiralty surveyed the island and concluded that it was uninhabitable. Even for convicts, it was considered too bleak. The first attempt to actually establish a permanent settlement on the island was not made by the Dutch or the British, but by the Americans. In 1810, Jonathan Lambert from Salem, Massachusetts, led a party of 3 to establish a trading station on Tristan, which he, in a fantastic piece of marketing, renamed the Isle of Refreshment. He claimed the island as his own tiny kingdom, with just 2 subjects. He brought with him a variety of crops such as tobacco to grow and supply passing ships. Unfortunately, he'd failed to account either for the local weather or the gales that regularly swept the island. All his different crops failed. When the Royal Navy warship HMS Ceramis arrived off the island in 1813, only one member of the trading party, Italian Tommaso Corri, who now went by the name Thomas Curry, was still alive. He told the captain of the Ceramis that his companions had drowned in a fishing accident. Despite the demise of the party and the island's remote location, the presence of the Americans had caused concerns at the Admiralty in London. Not because a US citizen had established a now failed trading post, but because Tristan had also been used by several US naval ships and privateers during the recent War of 1812. Things came to a head when USS Hornet captured HMS Penguin just off Tristan on the 23rd of March 1815. In what was the very last action of that war, 2 months after the Battle of New Orleans, the Penguin was so badly damaged in the battle that the Americans decided to sink her. The news of the demise of HMS Penguin at the hands of the American warship operating off Tristan arrived in London at just the same time as another letter which happened to come from the Governor of the Cape Colony, Lord Charles Somerset. The British had only recently taken possession of the Cape from the Dutch, and Somerset, whilst aware of the American activity at far off Tristan, was actually far more concerned as to whether the British could use the island as a watering stop for ships travelling from Britain to India and China. By the way, Lord Charles was the older brother, by 20 years, of the future Lord Raglan, commander of British troops during the Crimean War. With the 2 letters on his desk, the Secretary for War and the Colonies, Lord Bathurst, consulted the Prime Minister and the Prince Regent, and in September 1815 authorised Somerset to take control of Tristan and its tiny surrounding islands, both as a supply station and to prevent any further mischief from the Americans. By the time Somerset received the letter in early 1816, there was another imperative for the British to seize the island. In October 1815, Napoleon Bonaparte had arrived to serve out his exile on St. Helena. Despite lying 1,500 miles over 2,000 kilometres away, the British authorities were paranoid that the French might use the tiny islands in the Atlantic, like Tristan, to mount a rescue operation. And let's not forget that Napoleon did have form when it came to escaping from exile. In 1815, he'd slipped off the island of Elba and landed at the Gulf Juan on the south coast of France. 110 days later, he was defeated at the Battle of Waterloo. It was this past behaviour that had resulted in the British convincing their allies to exile him to the middle of the Atlantic. Still, they were taking no chances. Both Ascension Island and Tristan would be garrisoned to prevent any rescue. And whilst you might think this is all just a bit over the top, there were actually several plans hatched by Bonaparte's supporters to rescue Napoleon, including one involving a British criminal mastermind using primitive submarines. I kid you not. I'm going to tell that intriguing story very soon, so watch out for it. Anyway, after the South Atlantic winter had delayed any expeditions, on the 14th of August 1816, HMS Falmouth, under the command of Captain Robert Festing, arrived off the north coast of Tristan, having sailed from Cape Town. For the next 3 days, Captain Festing ferried a small garrison of seamen and marines ashore along with some supplies. They were greeted by Thomas Curry and a Spanish teenager who had jumped ship from a visiting merchantman. Having claimed the islands for King George III, Captain Festing set off for Cape Town, leaving the tiny garrison under the command of Royal Navy Lieutenant David Rice. Festing would finish his naval career as a Rear Admiral. Upon his arrival back in Cape Town, he found that Governor Somerset was growing increasingly concerned about the potential for Napoleon to escape from St. Helena. Lord Charles decided to strengthen the garrison. Consequently, HMS Falmouth once more set sail for Tristan, this time carrying a garrison of soldiers, commanded by Captain Josias Cluter from the 21st Light Dragoons. Cluter actually came from a Cape Dutch family and was commissioned in the British Army in 1809, when he was still just 14 years of age. Transferring from the 15th Hussars, he joined the 21st Light Dragoons, who were stationed back in the Cape, where he became an aide-de-camp to Governor Somerset. He would eventually become the first South African to rise to the rank of general in the British Army. Accompanying Captain Cluter were 3 more officers: Lieutenant Aitchison from the Royal Artillery, Lieutenant Atkinson of the 72nd Regiment of Foot, and Dr. Evers, a medical officer. They arrived on the 28th of November, 1816, and the two garrisons were swapped, with Cluta's composite garrison of Royal Artillery and men of the 72nd going ashore. The 72nd would later become the Seaforth Highlanders. Lieutenant Acheson from the Royal Artillery set to work constructing a defensive work, including gun emplacements overlooking the shoreline, which was named Fort Malcolm. The garrison camped slightly further inland, initially in tents, which were replaced by stone buildings. This settlement they named Somerset Camp, as a nod to the governor over at the Cape. On the 7th of December, Captain Cluta conducted a census, in which he reported that the island garrison consisted of 5 officers, the 3 already mentioned, himself, and another officer from the 72nd who was conducting a botanical survey of the island. There were also 36 NCOs and privates. Included in that number was one Corporal William Glass, of whom we're going to hear a lot more about in a moment. It was not exactly a huge army, but if the French arrived, it would not be the garrison they needed to worry about as much as the treacherous seas around the island. Also present were 6 seamen from HMS Falmouth who could handle those treacherous waters. And finally there were 9 male civilians, including Curry and his Spanish servant, 10 women, wives of some of the men, and 12 children. The garrison were particularly intrigued by Thomas Curry, the last of American Lambert's party. He claimed that Lambert had hidden a treasure on the island, and he, Curry, would reveal the hiding place if the soldiers treated him well. The soldiers treated him very well, plying him with drink to loosen his tongue. However, a few months later he died, possibly from the effects of that alcohol, without ever sharing his secret. The mystery of Lambert's treasure continues to this day. Life on the island was challenging. Supplies were limited, construction was slow due to the rough terrain, and communication with the outside world was non-existent except for occasional ships. Still, the men endured. Some hunted seals and birds for fresh meat, others tried to cultivate potatoes and other hardy vegetables in the volcanic soil. I mentioned just now that any attempt by the French to seize the island was likely to be thwarted as much by the rough seas as Captain Cluta's garrison. And that was reinforced to the British in 1817. On the 28th of September, the 16-gun brig sloop HMS Julia arrived off the island. However, the weather conditions were so bad that she spent the next 2 days cruising off the island until the 1st of October, when she was able to anchor about 2 miles offshore. That night a gale swept in from the west, ripped the Royal Naval vessel from its anchor and drove her onto the cliffs, smashing her to pieces. 55 sailors, plus the wife of the ship's master, drowned. With that tragic loss, the Admiralty came to the rapid conclusion that the French would be mad to even attempt to use Tristan as a base to rescue Napoleon. The governor of the Cape Colony, Lord Charles Somerset, gave the order to abandon the island. Now, whilst most of the garrison must have been overjoyed to receive this order, 3 of them asked to stay. Their leader was Corporal William Glass, the artilleryman who we mentioned a little while ago. Glass, born in Kelso in the Scottish borders in 1786, had enlisted in the British Army in 1804. Intriguingly, he didn't use his family surname of Glasgow, but used Glass instead. Why? We really don't know. He was posted to the Cape Colony in 1806, which the British had recently taken control of from the Dutch. Marrying a local mixed race or Creole woman, Maria Magdalena Linders, he soon had a small family. And Mrs. Glass was one of the women to accompany the garrison to Tristan da Cunha, along with 2 of their children. Now in November 1817, Corporal Glass informed Captain Cluta that he wished to remain on the island along with his family. He persuaded 2 fellow soldiers to also remain, John Nankervell and Samuel Burnell, both from Plymouth in Devon. On the 7th of November 1817, the 3 men signed a formal partnership agreement. It stated that they would share all stores, livestock, tools and profits equally. And this written accord, though simple, laid the foundation for a communal ethos that still characterises Tristan's administration to this day, where island revenues, especially from their fisheries, are still allocated by a locally elected island council. A few days later, just over a year after they had arrived, the garrison were withdrawn, leaving Glass and his tiny colony 1,500 miles from the nearest inhabited settlement. Life for these settlers was harsh, but oddly liberating too. With no commanding officers or colonial administrators looking over their shoulders, they worked and lived as equals. Passing ships occasionally dropped anchor, bringing news, occasional trade, and every now and then new settlers. In 1821, a Swedish sailor deserted his ship to join the community. 5 years later, in 1826, a colourful figure named Thomas Swain arrived. An ageing English sailor from Hastings, already in his 60s, Swain claimed that he was the very man who caught the dying Admiral Nelson in his arms as he fell mortally wounded at Trafalgar. A tall tale from a sailor? Well, maybe, but who knows? What we do know with more certainty is that he lived to be a centenarian, dying on the island in 1862 at the age of 102. Swain's arrival brought the bachelor population of Tristan up to 5. This led Gloucester to request that the captain of the Duke of Gloucester, a reasonably regular visitor to the island, sail to St Helena and try and persuade some ladies to up sticks and settle on Tristan. Incredibly, he returned in 1827 with 5 mixed-race women, and the cosmopolitan population of the island suddenly started to grow. By 1832, there were reportedly 22 children on the island. More arrivals followed. In 1836, a Dutchman named Peter Groen, later anglicised to Peter Green, came ashore and stayed. American whalermen, including Thomas Rogers and Andrew Hagan, joined in subsequent years. Many of the current population are descended from these early settlers, with less than 10 surnames in the community. By 1856, Tristan's population had grown to 96. In 1867, the island received a rare royal visitor. Prince Alfred, Duke of Edinburgh, the second son of Queen Victoria, arrived aboard HMS Galatea. In honour of his visit, the island's main settlement was formally named Edinburgh of the Seven Seas, a name it retains to this day. Thus, from a tiny military garrison came a small but resilient civilian community, self-reliant, cooperative, and profoundly rooted in its Atlantic isolation. Yet global currents would inevitably reach even this most distant outpost of British territory. The decline in the whaling industry in the late 19th century was the first major blow to fall on the island. Whaling ships had previously been a crucial source of trade, supplies, and even new settlers. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 only compounded the problem. Ships bound for the east no longer passed by the Cape, and even fewer had reason to make the arduous and increasingly pointless journey to Tristan da Cunha. By 1900, the population had shrunk to just 64. Matters grew worse in 1906 when a fungal disease devastated the island's potato crop. On Tristan, potatoes were not merely a staple, they were the currency. Bartered, traded, and eaten daily, their loss brought the community to the brink of famine. Yet even then, the islanders refused to abandon their home. Nothing can better sum up the island's isolation than the fact that it took 8 months for the news at the end of the First World War to arrive at Tristan. World War II brought the island into the modern era, albeit briefly. Fearing the reach of German U-boats across the South Atlantic, the British established a secret listening post on the island. The station monitored naval traffic and transmitted coded reports back to London. And while the number of U-boats in southern waters never matched those in the North Atlantic, several did threaten Allied shipping. One, U-860, was sunk just south of St Helena in 1944, and another not far from Cape Town. But when the war ended, Tristan quickly returned to its slow and steady rhythm. In 1957, 90 years after the last visit of a Duke of Edinburgh, the husband of Queen Elizabeth II, Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, visited the island aboard the royal yacht Britannia. 4 years later, disaster was to strike the island. In October 1961, the long-dormant volcano at the island centre suddenly erupted. The entire population, now numbering 264, was evacuated to Cape Town by a Dutch merchant ship. From there, they were transported to the UK aboard the Union Castle liner Stirling Castle and settled at a disused RAF base at Colshot near Southampton. The British government expected that they would integrate into mainland life. New homes were provided, jobs sought, and children enrolled into schools. But in 1963, with the island declared safe, the Tristanian exiles decided that the remote island in the South Atlantic was more home than Hampshire, and almost all the population return to Tristan. Today, Tristan da Cunha remains a British overseas territory. An administrator represents the British monarch on the island, working in conjunction with the locally elected Island Council. The population typically hovers just above 200, with nearly all the residents living in Edinburgh of the Seven Seas. The community operates on cooperative principles laid down nearly 2 centuries earlier: collective ownership of the land, shared resources, and an enduring emphasis on mutual aid. Access remains difficult. There is no airport, and the few ships that service the island, usually from Cape Town, do so only a handful of times a year, bringing in supplies that most of the rest of us in the world take for granted. The nearest hospital, for instance, is in Cape Town, 1,700 miles away. The seas around the island, whilst treacherous, are rich in lobsters and crayfish, now a vital part of the island's modest economy. Tristan also derives income from its stamps, which fascinate philatelists, principally due to the remote location of the island, along with their depiction of local wildlife and indeed the island's history. Visitors, who must be approved by the Island Council in advance, might be surprised to discover the world's most remote golf course on the island. Though less a manicured green and more a wind-blown pasture, shared with cattle and strewn with volcanic rocks, it is emblematic of Tristan's rugged charm. The story of the tiny community and the territory of Tristan da Cunha has largely passed the world by. And yet, its story is a fascinating one, of no great value apart from denying it to American privateers and anyone who wanted to rescue Napoleon from his exile. It could easily have been left deserted nearly 200 years ago. But 3 of the garrison, led by Corporal Glass and accompanied by his wife and children, stayed to found a tiny community. A community that, despite their isolation and everything nature has thrown at them, continues to live there to this day, as rugged as the very island itself. Well, I hope you enjoyed that story of Britain's Napoleonic War garrison on the remote island of Tristan da Cunha, and the tiny community that calls this British overseas territory their home. Watch out for the spin-offs from this story that I'm going to produce at USS Hornet battling HMS Penguin, and the conspiracies to rescue Napoleon from St. Helena, including that story of a British criminal mastermind and those primitive submarines. In the meantime, I'm Chris Green, the History Chap. Thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I look forward to sharing more stories from British history with you very soon.